thanks for tuning in to Power Athlete Radio. Training for quote-unquote power has become an increasingly sexy adage to strength and conditioning as of late. But as some of you may know, this imperative emphasis to displaying strength dynamically is no new phenomenon. Coaches and researchers have been studying the benefits of power-based training as well as how to increase the performance biomarkers associated with it for quite some time. Our guest today, Dr. Bryan Mann, plays an integral part furthering our knowledge of power. Assistant Director of Strength and Conditioning at the University of Missouri, Bryan has developed a passion and network of contemporaries whose obsession is performance. With a background in competitive powerlifting and a shit ton of academic research, Dr. Mann has meticulously studied the physiology of speed and strength. Today, he brings you the biology breakdown of what occurs inter- and intramuscularly to accomplish just that. Also, we were thrilled to have on celebrity guest host Matt Vincent to help bump our ratings. Thank you for that, Matt. And without further ado, this is episode 213.
Power Athlete Nation, what is up? We have a special guest host with us. We have Matt Vincent, Austin, Texas. We have John Wellborn, Austin, Texas, and myself. Matt, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Matt Vincent. I compete in the Scottish Highland Games, and now I'm helping host a podcast.
Not a
podcast.
podcast.
The premier podcast.
The premier podcast for strength and conditioning.
In strength and conditioning.
Nice, I like that.
Yeah, so, it's interesting. If you say things over and over again, eventually people start to listen. And you know what? If you Google the premier podcast in strength and conditioning, you know what comes up? Power Athlete Radio.
Nice. I didn't know that.
We have a special guest, and selfishly, hopefully it's, our pre-talk notes will jump up on there, but we have an awesome guest in terms of velocity-based training and world-class strength coach, and just somebody I've been really actually geeking out, following his stuff, and excited to get him on and talk about how to necessarily increase speed, increase athleticism, and make people better in the weight room, and how to gauge it. Pretty exciting stuff.
Yes, sir. So, Dr. Bryan Mann, would you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah. My name obviously is Bryan Mann. I started out in strength and conditioning back in 1999 under a guy named Rick Perry, who's now with the Chicago Bears. I went to Arizona State under Joe Ken, University of Tulsa under Pat Ivey, back to Missouri State with Rick Perry, and then Pat Ivey got the job at University of Missouri, and I came here in 2004, and I've been here ever since. Come 2011, I got my PhD, and I had a dual role up until recently, and now I'm no longer an active strength coach. Whenever the transition hit, I wanted to protect my family, and so I'm a professor in the Department of Physical Therapy. I'm the director of research for the athletic department and the director of research for the Human Performance Institute. Also do a lot of stuff with the NSCA. I'm the state director for it. I'm the chair for the College Strength and Conditioning Coaches Group. And I helped do a new certification form, the LIFTS course, where it's a hands-on teaching thing. So I've been around the block a little bit. I've worked with Olympians, world champs, national champs, that sort of thing. I never spent any time in the pro sport league, but I've had many athletes go on to pro sports. So that's me in a nutshell, I guess. Poor boy from backwoods Oklahoma, is now a professor. So that's about it.
I was going to say, dude, that's a hell of a resume.
Yeah, mine's way quicker than that. I got a general studies degree from LSU.
There you go.
I've actually seen my degree.
I don't think
to my parents' house.
I don't think anybody has.
Yeah.
Oh man.
So we got a lot of questions, Bryan. So
Sounds good. Let's get to it.
Bryan and I were talking before the show about compensatory acceleration. I think that's a good lead in because that's one of our primary uses of velocity-based training. So, Bryan, could you kind of introduce us to velocity-based training? So I know there's a set definition, and it may not be a common term for many of our listeners.
Well, velocity-based training is basically just utilizing it's a couple-pronged approach. And the first is simply feedback, and you get the feedback of the velocity. And honestly, just simply having the feedback of the velocity causes somebody to have compensatory acceleration whenever you get down to it, because they see the speed, they want to go faster. They get actual concrete feedback. It's not move as fast as you can, it's move over this velocity, and they get that. You put a score on it, it becomes competitive. Then you can utilize the velocity to dictate the load of the barbell. All training is governed by two principles. Regardless of what type of programming you use, if it's undulating, if it's concurrent, if it's I'm drawing a blank on a bunch of block, whatever.
Oh yeah, max effort. I mean, you conjugate system, progressive overload. I mean, like you said, undulating periodization. Classical periodization. I mean, dude,
and it's all governed by the same two things. There's the specific adaptations to impose demands or said principle, and then there's progressive overload, which if you want to increase the adaptation, you've got to increase the stimulus. So, by utilizing velocity, you are able to use that specific adaptations to impose demands because every trait essentially has a corresponding velocity. And where we really kind of had everything take off was with Buddy Morris and Tom Myslinski were a couple of my mentors.
Sure.
And they introduced me to what they called the strength continuum. And it was from Bosco, and Bosco's main opponent isn't the right word, but the guy that one of his contemporaries that they would go at each other quite a bit. But that's how people get better, right? Iron sharpens iron, man sharpens man. There was that strength continuum, and it was 0 to 15% was non-trainable, right? It was blessed by the hand of God. 15 to 40 was starting strength. 40 to 60 was non-quantifiable, and it was non-quantifiable not because nothing happened, but because there was such a crossover of so many different traits. 60 to 80% was accelerative strength, and 80+% was absolute strength. And then whenever we started looking at the velocities for the big rock exercises, that's where the zones came from. It's like, holy cow, we're within 5-6% of the bench press and the squat being the same velocity. So let's just rock and roll here, bench squat and deadlift. Why did we choose those exercises? Well, I think we all came from a powerlifting background. So, that's why we chose those exercises. Are they necessarily the best? Well, no. There's other exercises that could have a greater transfer. Some people like front squat. Some people like overhead squat. Some people like Zercher squat. Some people, they've got their different methods. And
or we have like a Bulgarian squat. Like who do we have on that told us that bilateral hinging was worthless?
Boyle.
Oh yeah,
He
yeah.
didn't
So
say worthless.
sorry, I'm paraphrasing. No,
It'll never work.
but we had Mike Boyle on, who made an interesting point that he said, he was working with so many guys that were so injured that just basically doing some form of bilateral hinging wasn't necessarily useful for them anymore.
But with his youth athletes, they began with a goblet squat. So
yes.
They began with the bilateral.
And then they progressed into a unilateral as people became more advanced.
Or broken.
No, well, I mean, and this. I mean, do you remember when the Russians were doing were kicking ass and all the Americans were trying to figure out why? And then they put out, I think it was a ruse. They put out that Pisarenko wouldn't squat. All he was doing was these like massive like step ups. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
Yeah, and they were putting out like he was doing like none of the high level Russians were squatting anymore. They were only doing really heavy step ups. And then all the Americans tried to do it, but the Russians were lying to them because there was a bunch of stuff in the training halls because they went and they were all back squatting.
So a spy game for strength.
Star Wars. Yeah, pretty close. Pretty close.
That's right.
But like that. I mean, and not to get this off the rails, because I do that so often, but I mean, is there a way to test velocity for, like, for example, like a Bulgarian split squat? Could you do it meaningful with like unilateral type movements?
Yeah, you can actually do that with anything, with any movement that you do in the weight room. If you can attach something to it to measure the velocity, you can alter the load by it. And especially if you're trying to do it for power with the compensatory acceleration, if you want to look at it from that lens, in that basically you just take the technique, make sure that the athlete's technique is solid, and then just take them up and low. And all the devices that I'm aware of will give you power, right? Whenever you find peak power, that's the velocity at which you should be training if you're trying to hit that compensatory acceleration. And then so you can watch the load change from there. I've seen people do it with Bulgarian split squats. Now, it gets a little tricky on things like that because balance comes into play. And was that rep and power super fast because you're falling over to the left? Or was it, because you were rock solid and flying on up?
So I mean, and it's probably easier to compare people in terms of like, just basic bilateral type movements, like a squat, a bench, and a deadlift. Because I mean, not only are those universally done, I mean, I've seen people do some unilateral unilateral movements where I think, oh my God, that doesn't look like anything I've ever seen. So
Right.
I think, just in terms of standardizing, so basically you guys went back and you noticed that there was different zones in velocity. Can we go through, like we mentioned those, but I mean, is there directly like, this percentage, this speed directly attacks this, like you said, specific adaptation to impose demands?
Absolutely.
For like muscle, for fiber type. I mean, because we run into people all the time that are like, oh, I need to get faster. And to get faster, all they have to do is get stronger. I have people that are, want to get stronger, and by actually dropping their body fat or necessarily increasing the, cross-sectional size of a muscle, they can increase strength. I mean, there's a million different ways to attack it. And,
Right.
I'm sure there's a million different factors that you can throw into this. It's really a tweak based on each individual, correct?
Yeah, you're right. I'll step back and go with the overarching view with how everything interrelates from a physiological standpoint, and then go back in on the velocity. We got to realize that the muscle fiber, right? That's called whenever we're producing force, we've got two components. We've got a series elastic component, and we've got a parallel elastic component. And the series elastic component is essentially the muscle itself, right? The muscle fibers and how the sarcomeres line up in a series. Well, how to improve force from that, we've got four main ways. Two or more on the muscle fiber itself side, and two of them are on the neural aspect of it. And they all will get affected from training. And the first is let's look at one of the myofibrillar, right? So if there's some different things you can do to the myofibril itself, the actin and the myosin, right? And I guess because I'm jumping ahead, we've got that sliding filament theory where the myosin pulls the actin filament across of it. That's what causes the shortening for the contraction that causes movement, right? So what we want to make sure that we do is get that myosin as big and as strong as we can. And then we can look at it individually, like the myosin head and how it can withstand forces, and using like eccentrics and stuff. Like that's part of how Cal Dietz's triphasic works, is through the tissue remodeling through that. Then also within the myofibril, if you increase the cross-sectional area of it, you can change the angle of pination. Okay? And that just means, how does that muscle come into the tendon, and what sort of angle does it come? The more perpendicular that it comes in, the more force that it can produce because of just line of pull.
Wow. So the larger a muscle, the more force it can generate, just based off of the angles. Wow.
Right.
But structural.
Yeah, structural. I mean, because
functional tissue mass versus sarcoplasmic.
Well, we've always known that the larger cross-sectional size of a muscle will theoretically produce more force.
Right.
And I always thought that it was just more the idea that there was more available motor units, more trained. I mean, if you're increasing cross-sectional size, you're obviously doing something to do it, but I mean, angle of pination is pretty interesting.
Yep.
Yeah. And then the cross-sectional area, of course, it does. You're probably not increasing the motor unit, but you're increasing the size of each myofiber within the motor unit, because you're not going to lay down new neurons or something like that.
Have we figured out how to do that yet?
Yeah, you know what? If we do, we're going to be some rich people. But genetic engineering, that's where it's going to be.
I just spoke at Summer Strong and had the opportunity to connect with Cal Dietz, who was another kindred spirit, and we connected and got to talk for a couple hours. And I was busting his balls about he wrote a book that was basically claiming like he invented accentuated negatives, and he just laughed. And I was like, "Come on, dude!" And he's like, you wouldn't believe. I accused him of being like T Nation, just recycling old stuff, and just funny dude. But I mean, such a sharp dude, and really enjoyed what he was talking about. But and I actually talked about that. I'm like, have we figured out a way to add more motor units? Have we figured out how to increase this stuff from that point? And he said the same thing. He's like, we're looking, but when we find out, we'll be rich. So
yeah, I always say Cal's my brother from another mother, man. The first time that we met, we were cracking jokes and finishing each other's sentence in the first 5 minutes.
Yeah, he, like we were talking earlier, we had Derek Hansen yesterday with the EMS, which I've always been a big user of. And so I started talking to Cal a bit about it, and he had run into the same problem I have, that somebody didn't have a unit that was able to do what he wanted in terms of technology and kind of hardware and software. And so when I gave it to him and showed him, he was like, oh man. And he's been sending me these emails, and I'm like, dude, we'll jailbreak this thing and do whatever you want. And he's like, dude, that's what I like to hear. And so he's like, I got about 18 different protocols that I want to try. I just have never had a unit that could do it. And that dude's like yourself, like a high level thinker who is trying to solve some really complex problems in some unique ways.
Yeah, he absolutely is. Got done with the myofiber, right?
Yeah. Let's get to the neural side.
Sorry. Yeah.
So, well, we got one more let's go with the other one on the muscle side, and that's going to be the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And if you go back to the physiology book, we remember that the sarcoplasmic reticulum's responsibility is the release and reabsorption of calcium. Okay. Now, why that's important is because the calcium, I'm not a physiology guy. I'm just playing one on TV right now. But the calcium unlocks the tropomyosin, which unlocks the troponin to give an active binding site on the actin for the myosin to grab a hold of. So the faster you can release and absorb calcium, the faster you're going to be able to achieve muscle contraction. Okay? So that's another way that you have to increase force. Now let's get over the neural side. And then we've got Henneman's size principle. Right. And Henneman's size principle basically is, you've got your low threshold to your high threshold motor units. And you typically start in type 1, and this type 2 high threshold motor unit's pretty much like blocked off, and you got to jailbreak it, right? And if you lift heavy loads, the Golgi tendon organ learns that, hey, you know what, this is safe. I'm not going to get blown up or anything. And all of a sudden, that door kind of comes open, and that barrier comes lower and lower and lower, that you don't have to go as hard to get into those high threshold motor units, right? Essentially.
Wow, that's interesting. So the idea is that as you train more, not only is it kind of the body's defense mechanism kind of almost down regulating in a way to allow you to be able to get into places you can't. I mean, we always talk about beginners not having an efficient central nervous system. That's why we've always fought against beginners doing singles. To necessarily have a meaningful 1 rep max, you have to have not only inter and intramuscular coordination, but you also have to have efficient CNS opportunity to have done enough reps to really be able to get the body to work in cohesion. Or
right.
And it's kind of that's another interesting point that I hadn't really thought about.
Dr. Mann, does this kind of explain, I don't know if you've ever introduced new movements, kind of skips or kind of drills to track folks, and you see tension in their hands. We're just kind of doing relaxed skips or any ankle work and unnecessary tension. Is that kind of a overreaction of the Golgi tendon, or am I?
I'll be completely honest with you. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I've always wondered this, just kind of that observation in teaching athletes new skills at our course.
Well, the thing that I found is that it's easier, and I know this sounds like almost like crazy talk, but it's easier to teach people things that are readily able to learn new skills. So I always went back this on football, and I remember when I was pretty young, my brother would come home every summer to work, and he played college football. So then I was his training partner. And I remember for the first couple of days he got home, he got a couple of my buddies who were also playing football to go out. And after about 4 or 5 days, none of them showed up anymore. And the reason being was they got tired of learning the same movements, because he's like, well, if we can't learn how to take a zone step, we can't learn anything else. And so after spending 3 days, like an hour straight of just teaching these kids to zone step, and not one of them could ever get that zone step, they just didn't come back. And I remember asking my brother, I'm like, he's like, dude, I can't teach them anything else until they learn the first step. And if they can't learn it, he's like, and I'm like, well, but I learned it in the first 2 or 3 minutes. And he was like, hence the difference in athletes. Right. And he's like, you have the ability to learn new skills. And if I teach you something, I don't have to go back and reteach you and remind you, because then we can progress through. And I remember even just that rudimentary thing, like thinking about, central nervous system efficiency, training volume. I mean, are you able to learn new skills? And the people that are able to learn new skills are probably able to learn more and more. And we learned that at our seminar. Mm-hmm. If people are not forced outside of their comfort zone and taught new skills, then they effectively lose the ability to learn other new skills, which is, we've had this rare distinction to travel the world almost over the last decade and teach hundreds of seminars around the globe, trying to teach an athletic form of training to people that are really steeped in, the CrossFit stuff, which is basically sagittal plane bilateral hip hinging over and over again. And everything can be done in the doorway, in a hallway, everything straight ahead, no rotation, no lateral movement. I mean, no transverse plane. very very rare amount of unilateral movements. And what was interesting is seeing people do these forms of training that are predicated really on submaximal efforts, with a emotional quotient of high intensity, which isn't our definition of high intensity. People all kind of had the same similar problems over and over again. And it just, after a while you see it and you just know what to expect because people are a product of what they do. And I'm sure you can look at certain athletes and you can see a remarkable difference in physique. Some people that lift heavy weights over 85% and people that lift 60 to 85%. I can look at somebody and know whether or not they lift heavy weights or not, just because of and I used to do this in football. When I walked up to the line, I had a few seconds to assess a guy and I could tell who had put in the time doing the shit that nobody likes to do. All of a sudden you see a guy with a big ass, big hamstrings, big back, opposed from the dude that looks like, big chest, big quads, $1 million, looks like a pro bodybuilder. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you see the dude turn to the side and he looks like a racehorse and you think to yourself, fuck, this dude's going to crush me. So, it kind of, like we say, you become a byproduct of what you do, and
form follows
function.
Yeah.
Shit, said principle. Damn. Okay. Sorry. I don't mean to cut you off, dude.
It's all good. What we were on Henneman size principle, we get that one knocked out.
Yep.
Last one is going to be rate coding, which you kind of alluded to whenever you're talking about the inter and intramuscular coordination. And it's whenever you get back down to the lowest level, it is the nervous system sends down electrical impulse that causes a muscle to twitch. And then the faster that and more efficient that your nervous system is sending down signals, it turns from single twitch to multiple twitch to unfused tetanus to fused tetanus as somebody goes along and gets better. And that's part of the, somebody starting out looking like a baby deer and then end up being able to sprint pretty well, doing new drills or new exercises. So with the rate coding, it's just the speed and the efficiency of which it comes down to the individual muscle cell within the muscle fibers, within the muscle group, and then between muscle groups. And that's really where the velocity-based training and the ballistics and those sorts of exercises, that's where they really affect things. So you've really got to have a balance among the four. So within that said principle, we can use velocity to work on several things. It's the most efficient at improving power, but we can absolutely look at it to do like the absolute strength if we're wanting to look at 0.5 meters per second and below. We can look at it to develop accelerative strength, and that's 0.5 to 0.75 meters per second. We can look at it to develop strength speed, which is strength and conditions of speed. It's the lower half of the power curve, and that's 0.75 to 1.0 meters per second. Then we've got speed strength, which is about 1 to about 1.3. It's probably really like 1 1/4, but a lot of times the bar is going to pop up a little bit, and that's going to increase the range of motion. That increases the velocity. For speed strength, and anything above that, I calculate as starting strength, and that's on the individual motions. Now, I guess I need to go back and describe, because there's a lot of misunderstandings. And I put out some articles on these for the nomenclature. I took the Soviet nomenclature. Why? Because if Verkhoshansky, Medvedev, Ajan, and Roman were talking about this, and I don't know if I said Yuri or not yet. I haven't had enough caffeine today, I guess.
That's unacceptable.
Yeah, it very well is. Yeah, it very well is. I thought I had a whole box of caffeine packets back there, and it was empty. And I don't know if somebody ripped me off or if I just hadn't been paying attention.
Just cut a couple of.
How many kids do you have?
I've just got one right now. She's 20 months old, and she is running me ragged.
Okay, I was going to say, I got 3 kids. I got a little boy who's about 14 months, and I got 2 almost 6-year-olds, twin girls. And I probably drink like 6 double espressos before 6:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
And so like, my little boy's teething, so I'm up pretty early, and I just start pounding that stuff. And then when these guys come to the podcast, they're like, dude, you're so wound up. I'm like, I've been up since like 5 a.m. drinking coffee. Are you kidding me?
I got like 10 cups in me right now.
So Tex doesn't have any kids. He's unmarried. He's probably just, waking up like a baby doe, just waking up, stretching his neck. I'm just waiting for you to get weird. I feel like $1 million. You son of a bitch.
I'm all half broken and full of caffeine. It's great.
Whenever you have a cut, it just, it comes out looking like caffeine powder,
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. But the traits, so when having to go back to the nomenclature, starting strength, right? That is the ability to rapidly overcome inertia and start from a dead stop. So think about if the defensive back is given a couple of yards as the receiver, flying off the ball, going as fast as he can, trying to blow by him. Then accelerative strength. That's one that's often misunderstood, and that is the ability to accelerate through a load. Everybody, for some reason, thinks that it's accelerating like sprinting down a track. That's not it. It's accelerating through a load. So think about the offensive lineman and defensive lineman firing off against each other.
I always call that one torque. So I always imagine like speed, especially when I think about things in terms of trucks and cars. But horsepower is your ability to get through the wall. Torque was the idea of like how much power can I actually take through the brick wall.
So like squatting with bands or chains or something.
Well, yeah, I mean,
that.
but like for football, I always thought, and what kind of gave me this kind of like way to explain it to people, because in football it's kind of interesting. You have guys at different intellectual levels. You could talk like with Bryan, and then you can have another dude where you're like, okay, think about it like this, bro. How fast you can move your hands from point A to point B is speed.
Yeah, that's
right. When I get to B and I have to go through the dude's chest and try to break his fucking sternum and stop his heart, where I get to B the C on the backside of his back, that is torque. So like speed is important, but my power and my strength to get through him and basically stop his heart like a Mortal Kombat style, that's torque. And
I'm more of a friendly conversation with his body and hope that we can agree for him not to get past
in
me.
Football, the idea where I used to watch guys that had pretty good punches and were pretty quick, but they couldn't seem to reset a defender. And like in football, as an offensive lineman, as you set that guy's on his trajectory, my ability to punch him and then make him reset, take a step and get him outside, like dictate something against him, use my power through. And that was what I always said, you got to have fast hands and have speed, but you have to have enough like power and torque to be able to reset and force your will upon him. And you can use your head, you can use your hands. I mean, some guys were big punch guys, and then other dudes just fucking held on for dear life and just hope they wouldn't get fucking ragdolled. So that's actually interesting, as I've not heard it explained as accelerated strength. And what's kind of neat is there's actually a very certain time domain based off of the velocity-based training that we can use to adapt this.
Now, an interesting thing along those lines is that I admittedly am not the sharpest tool in the shed, but I make sure to reach out to people who are. And we've got a bioengineer in our department, and I had him hook up and video analysis with offensive lineman, defensive lineman on the boards. And whenever the guy was blowing through somebody, like, right on, what I'm talking about on the boards. I don't know what the name of the drill is other than the boards.
Well, yeah, let me explain it. There's what they do is it's usually about a 2x8 or a 2x6 or 2x10, depending on what the coaches are. And back in the day, they actually used to be wooden boards. And then some equipment maker figured out that if we made them out of rubber, then when people stepped on them, they wouldn't fall and fucking bust their ass.
Yeah, we had the wood ones in high school.
The problem became that the training tool of the board was if they were slick fucking wood and you stepped on it, you got your ass beat.
Right.
So like I remember when all of a sudden they brought out these rubber ones, and I thought to myself, well, dude, this isn't going to work the same way, because normally
no punishment here.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I would try to do is I would try to lift the dude up, and as soon as I got him up on his toes, instantly his feet would come together. He would step on the board, at which point I could accelerate one way and then fucking pancake the dude. And to the point where I was like, and I understood leverages enough to be like, all I got to get this dude to do is fucking pirouette his feet, and he's done. And then when the rubber came in, it didn't really matter as much. So, but that's what the boards are. So, okay.
So whenever like I say, the offensive line was dominating the defensive lineman and had him on roller skates, he was moving at about 0.6 meters per second. Well, you look at that, that's right halfway in that 0.5 to 0.75, which was just like a, yes, I was right moment. That it was accelerative strength. So that is what it is right there. And those are usually the two that are most commonly misconstrued. But then there's the strength speed and the speed strength, and people used to have those as completely interchangeable, and they're not. And research has come out by a guy named Jundaka, and I'm sure I butchered his name. that he basically found the same thing as Robert Roman with the strength speed and the speed strength, except for he called it load velocity and velocity load, and that 0.75 to 1.0 was one thing, and 1.0 to 1.25 was the other.
Wow. Cool.
Doctor, how does a novice athlete play into this? So when we talk about speed and then inter and intra, they need that opportunity to kind of learn the movement pattern. Does speed come after that time frame, or do you want coaches talking speed first? Okay.
No, you've got to learn the technique first, and that's one of the. Sometimes you find out you've had unintended consequences to things that you've done, and one of the unintended consequences that's happened as a result of velocity-based training is that sometimes form has gone to shit. And people are only trying to move the barbell or whatever as fast as they can, and they forget how they're supposed to move it. So in my book, right, I've got a figure of my workouts, right? One of my workouts for a shot putter, and it was going into a power phase. And on that workout, I had 3 exercises out of the entire 4-day training week that were utilizing velocity. I had 2 more exercises that I would eventually start to use velocity on. And those 2 exercises, the only reason why I wasn't doing it yet is because their form still sucked.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we were doing a split jerk, and it was just seemed to be too technical. They were having a hard time figuring out how to split their feet, or maybe it's walking and chewing gum at the same time. Not sure which one it might have been, but you know, they were having a hard time with that, and they were having a hard time with the snatch. So instead of having the feedback of the velocity to worry about, all I want them to worry about is the technique, right? You know, you can do other more simple exercises to be able to do things to get some of the same traits out of the rate coding like you would out of the velocity, right? So you can't jump slow, right? I've never seen a slow box jump. Okay?
Well, I have, but it usually resulted in people with fucking dented shins and trip to the emergency room.
Fair enough. Fair point there.
So we basically don't worry about the velocity stuff with novice athletes until we master a little bit of mastery.
But I mean,
movement.
it's mastery of movement, it's technique, but it's also like we talked about. I mean, to effectively do these things, you have to have a trained, efficient central nervous system to get everything to fire. And the one thing that we found is that as an amateur or a beginner, they don't have that. And you know what? What's weird is people are upset about that. I'm like, why?
You didn't earn it yet.
Yeah, well, that and also, I mean, we use just a basic, just kind of linear progression with our beginners, and you know, and I don't care where they start, because eventually, if you just keep adding load to the bar, eventually it will get heavy enough, right? And hopefully, we can sneak in and, you know, get some other neat things going, but. It's pretty amazing how quickly people want to jump past where they are in their training. And I think what was, at least for me, when I retired from the NFL and I got approached about CrossFit, about helping, you know, develop some sport specific stuff, and I showed them some programming, what blew their minds was I had one program for somebody day one, and I had a program for somebody that was, you know, an advanced athlete, and somebody in the middle. And I remember people asked me, what did I do for my training? And I remember being like, well, I can tell you what I did for my training, but if you do my training, you're not going to get the same effect. And they were like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, dude, my level of adaptation and the amount of stuff that I've done is so much more than you. Why would you think that you could just jump into this stuff? And why would you even think you would want to? And like, that was what kind of drives me crazy, especially when I see people, you know, selling programs or this guy do that. And I'm like, dude, we're all, even though we're all same decaying matter, we all have a different level of adaptation and exposure, different opportunity, different genetics, geography, whatever you want to go into. And you have to start the path at your point and then progress it this way. You can't jump in on anybody else's journey. And like, for example, we're doing a bunch of, you know, when we do our velocity-based stuff, I call it just compensatory acceleration cat training. So we were doing cat squats today on one of our programs, and a guy literally, as I was driving over, sent me his numbers. And I think he was doing, you know, 5 sets of 5, and his first set was at like 0.85 meters per second on all 5 reps. And he was pretty consistent. I think his slowest was like 0.83. And then all of a sudden he was resting 90 seconds. And by the 5th set, he was at like 0.4.
Oh, wow.
And he was like, I felt really slow on the last part. Why do you think this was? And I'm like, because probably you're fucking out of shape. Or or you didn't rest long enough. That 90 seconds that I recommended is assuming that you have created enough base level conditioning where you can start. Yeah, you can handle it. Like that was what we talked about yesterday with Derek Hansen. We were talking about some of the problems that we run into with NFL teams. And for me, with my own training, I didn't train in the off season with any of the teams because I didn't like one. For me to do well, I needed to be able to do more high intensity in terms of like maximal efforts in terms of things. Like I rather run out and sprint 40, do 10 40s that are within 90% or 90% of my fastest time, and with 2 or 3 minutes rest, and do that type of conditioning. Because for me, playing football, that was more beneficial than me going out and running 10 half gassers. And,
Right.
When I looked at the training that a lot of the teams were doing, especially when I played at the Eagles and whatnot, I was like, man, this is too many submaximal efforts, and your version of conditioning is different than what I want to do. I want to be able to, which kind of goes back to the Charlie Francis stuff.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I would show up and they would be like, hey, this guy went to every conditioning. You didn't show up to any of them. And I'd be like, no problem. Let's go test. And I would win every test, and I would win the conditioning test. I would win everything and then go in and play. And I'd be like, how is it I'm winning all this if these guys are kicking ass in the off season? And nothing against those coaches, because they were good coaches. I just don't think that the problem is when you paint everybody with a broad brush, you're going to miss somebody. And I knew that what they were doing wasn't, allowing me to be what I wanted to do. So, I mean, just kind of an interesting observation. And it's just the velocity stuff that you're talking about is for almost a very specific population of kind of intermediate to advanced, kind of that upper echelon. And I think most people, and you can comment on this much better than I can, most of the people out there training with barbells don't fall within that category.
No, of course
not.
I mean, like just, on your observation, I mean, you're in a university, you're probably dragging kids in off the street, for doing different tests or training athletes to do different things. How many people have you run into that fit within almost the, sweet spot of where you want to do velocity-based training?
I don't really go get kids off the street. I'm just going to research the athletes because I don't care about novice adaptations. I care about.
I always kind of imagine like kids walking by and you being like, "Hey, you want to make $20? I'm going to fucking set you on fire in the next 20 minutes. Get in here." But no.
I've never understood why people think strength training or lifting is any different than, say, learning how to ski or like learning how to ride a mountain bike. Like you don't get to downhill day one. Like I've been riding for 10 years.
Well,
I have a different set.
But I mean,
Google.
If you think about this, and this is kind of the interesting internet age, and like we all have social media, and so you see like the dude who's basically on every drug on the universe, but yet he's holding up and he's like, "This is my protein and my."
Right.
And if you if you do my training program, like like I was. Who like Michael Hearn, for example, I was watching some stuff with him. I mean, the dude's 46 years old. He is absolutely fucking shredded.
Yeah, it looks great.
I mean, looks like $1 million.
Yeah,
I mean, like, holy shit, that dude's shredded. And I'm thinking to myself, like, the amount of time and effort and work that it takes to not only have that tan or to have that good a hair is far outside of what I have available for myself, having 3 kids and a wife.
Or willing to do.
Well, I mean, I just don't have that many hours. Like his hair is amazing. So like that's a part of the thing I go back with is like, how do we, and you don't deal with this because you've basically, eschewed yourself and said, hey man, I'm going to just stick in academia where I can deal with what I want to deal with. Yeah. You don't have to fucking slug it out with the masses like we do. But like
the plebes.
I like what I've really, and power athletes based on this idea of battle the bullshit. Like I'm going to give you the straight fucking answer, whether or not it, results in you feeling bad or me feeling good or you buying anything. I don't give a shit. I want you to have the truth. And then based off of that good, hopefully truthful information, you can assess and make a valid decision without, stuff. So I'm trying to figure out like how you explain to people or almost put like a set of protocols together to show people that you are not at the point at which velocity-based training would be beneficial to you. So, I mean, that's something that I really work for too, is people are like, well, hey, I got a collar. I got this. I'm a tendo. I'm going with this. Why are these numbers? Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, how do we?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. So one of the things that we did was, people call me the VBT guy, and the earned or unearned, that's what it is. But really, what I am is the transfer guy. And what I say, I'm the transfer guy. That's what always been my goal, was how to get the most transfer training. And we implemented a level system. And, basically you came in, you learned technique. After you proved that you learned technique, we worked on more more base level strength stuff. So that's 65 to 85%, really looking at basically like the APRE 6. And then after that, we were looking at some absolute strength, like a Prilipin, and we would start to add in a little bit of velocity. And then whenever we got to the 4th level, it was specific traits and tons of velocity. So, we just you had to earn your way up. Now, how did they really earn their way up to getting velocity? Well, basically it was that one of the things that we did was we calculated power from vertical jump, which is just a simple equation. So if you've got body weight and jump height, we can estimate peak anaerobic power in watts. There's several different equations to use, but I like the Sears equation because his door is not too far from mine. We've published together, and I would be a major asshole if I didn't go ahead and use his equation. But that's how we did it with football. It's like, okay, is your power going up? Okay, well, your power isn't going up. Well, then we need to, change the stimulus. And honestly, one of the criteria ended up being about a double body weight squat. To say that was the actual criteria, but no, that wasn't it. But that's whenever the wheels started falling off, that they weren't getting any more powerful, that they just needed to get stronger up until that point.
That I read that almost exact point, and that's always kind of been our benchmark for whether or not people are ready to start more advanced training is the double body weight, because that was what the Russians talked about, people being able to do high-level plyometrics, Verkhoshansky with the depth jumps and some of the more, dynamic type things, that they were strong enough to protect themselves. And I always remember that. And, Verkhoshansky has a forums, which is still active, which is pretty cool, that even since he's passed, they still leave it up, and you can go search some things in there, which I'm sure you have, where you do a search and it pops up. And he made that interesting point to a guy that the guy was talking about, more advanced training. And he said, I needed people to be strong enough to protect themselves to survive the training. And that little piece was so, it was just like a small piece, but was so impactful for me, thinking about, are you strong enough to survive and protect your body to be able to go out and do these things? And then, but people look at things and they're like, well, hey, we'll try to do the most extreme shit, when in actuality, they're not strong enough, stable enough. They don't understand, stability, function, movement, technique, all these other key factors to effectively protect themselves from what they're attempting to do.
Right.
We found that same with the double body weight. So that's awesome.
Interesting sidebar there, that I just got done editing Yuri's newest book that was finished by his daughter Natalia on the shock method, and goes into great detail about everything going on with the depth jump and the other exercises within the shock method. So it'll be hopefully it'll be out by July, about the time that the national conference is.
Awesome.
But it'll be through Ultimate Athlete Concept and everything. It is fantastic.
The book that they released a couple years ago, his special training population book.
Special strength training or something like that. Yeah.
So they released that one, and there was a hypertrophy program in the back of that was so impactful. I remember I copied it out, and I remember, put it into spreadsheets and started looking at it and thought, like, man, I can't administer this to anybody because, you got to be pretty high level, but I could steal some things from it. And so I went back and I created some interesting points about how he does his microdosing and, the microcycles with the macro and the whole deal. And I remember that one program we ended up using, and it was as if people were growing like weeds. And to this day, I have one of the guys that I sent the program to, I'll still get emails from people asking, hey, can you send me that program that so-and-so did, because he still talks about it and he still uses it. And I think I told him, I was like, and I think he bought the book and he still didn't understand where I got it all. But it's all different to everybody. But no, Verkhoshansky's stuff, it's pretty interesting because, Louis references him at great length, but, Louis was looking at, or the West Side is looking at a kind of a concurrent template where they were trying to, train everything at once, where Verkhoshansky was very set on we're going to develop these pieces. And, we still argue with people all the time on concurrent training models versus, doing some form of block periodization.
Yeah. I actually go concurrent before I go conjugate. conjugate as Yuri talks about it.
Sure.
So and concurrent is what what I'm considering West Side style. Even though Louis calls it the conjugate method,
It's not.
looking at the definitions, I look at it as a concurrent method. Nothing against Louis, and if he listens to this, I'm probably going to get a nasty phone call about that. But that's just the way that that I look at it, based off of the nomenclature that Yuri and Mel and those others have put out.
Well, they were talking about the conjugate method, or he's talking about the conjugate method in terms of rotating movements, in terms of the law of accommodation. So we're going to keep changing bars, for example, whereas it's way more in depth than just rotating different implements.
Yeah, and you look at it, it comes back to the sport too. I mean, with powerlifting, that is the sport. So there you go. But whenever you're dealing with team sports that have got to develop anything other than just the single trait, then we've got other things that we've got to look at.
So this is something that piques my interest, and I want to stick with this topic of transfer training and working with sports versus a strength sport or a power sport. So one line you dropped when I listened to you speak at the NSCA conference back in January was causation versus correlation.
Yeah.
And you talk about the vertical jump test as something you use to see if the training is working. What other tests can coaches do, or do we have to rely on the games? Do we have to rely on the track events to see if the training is working? What else can our coaches take away to try to implement to see if their application is crossing over to the competition?
Excellent question. And one of the areas that we've got to have is key performance indicators for different sports, right? For track and field, for swimming, it's easy, right? All you have to do is the distance that they ran, how far they threw, how far they jumped. That's super easy. But the other team sports is where it gets a little interesting. And you've got to have different things to be able to look at other than the sport, because in team sport, I can't account for how good the other person is, right? Mm-hmm. So if you've got different things that the athlete that has been found to be related to success of the athlete, like maybe for an offensive defensive lineman, it's 10-meter time, standing long jump, and that 5-10-5 shuttle, or maybe it's the L drill, right? The 3-cone, whatever. I hear it called a million different names. Then you want to watch those to see if you're improving or not, and have the strength training related back to that. And if the strength training, like I talk about it in my book and a lot of my velocity lectures, there's 2 different papers that are out there, and I'm working on a third right now, that show that improvements in absolute strength alone do not necessarily improve speed and power. Studies came out of Oklahoma State with their football team, Texas A&M with their football team. Both the strength conditioning coaches are listed on the authorship there, so that it's not something that's jacked. That for the first year they saw huge improvements in strength. After that, they saw huge improvements in power. Years 2, 3, and 4, they saw huge improvements in strength. They did not see improvements in speed and power, indicating that there are other traits that need to be trained. So what do you need to do? Well, you need to do whatever it's going to cause that key performance indicator to go up, because that's what's going to enhance performance. It's different for every sport. And honestly, I ran some whenever I had more time, I messed around with our profile. I've got 16 years worth of data for our football team here. And I remember running some different tests and finding that different positions had different performance indicators. Offensive lineman, it was squat, bench, and standing long jump. Defensive lineman, it was the defensive tackle, I believe it was the 5-10-5 shuttle. And there was something on it was vertical jump. For the defensive ends and tight ends, it was the 3-cone drill and vertical jump. For the receivers, it was the 40-yard dash, and I don't remember anything for the other positions, unfortunately, right now. I could probably go back and dig around somewhere that's like 4 computers and 2 computer crashes ago, so hopefully I could find it somewhere. But, to say that it was a perfect relationship, it was not, but it was definitely there.
Do you think because for me personally, I had different performance matrix set out that I established pretty early, that I knew that if I were able to hit those numbers and do those things in the off season, I was ready to necessarily go back.
Exactly.
Play football.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, and that was pretty when I would talk to people and they would say, hey, you ready to go? And I'm like, I'm almost ready. I'll let you know when I'm ready, and I'm usually always ready right around the 4th of July. And when I can't get ready by the 4th of July, it's probably time for me to retire. And that seems pretty interesting. And I'm kind of surprised that more teams, whether it be in college and the NFL and whatnot, don't necessarily take that into effect. I mean, they just, hey, did you pass your conditioning test? They ask people to come in and do all these kind of serious deals. It's pretty interesting that you could almost tie and say that these drills or the performance in these drills or this lift or this is most tied to this athlete's performance. I mean,
I'm not surprised that it doesn't happen more often for a couple of reasons, and one of them is because of the amount of time that amount of testing periods that we had to have, and that was as a result of our head football coach. Gary Pinkel was a Don James person. So we ran the same sort of thing where we needed to test in the spring and in the summer on everything but the 40 in the summer, but we tested everything else then. And if we had to have certain percentages of PR rates and things like that to prove our worth for our job. Often as we had to test, it was really easy to look and say, was this change in performance? Was it technique, or was it being able to correlate back to these variables? So, I don't know if they're, any of the other people that came out of the Don James tree, if they stuck with everything like Don James did, like Nick Saban has, they'll be able, I'm not saying they have or they haven't, but they would be able to go back and look at that sort of thing.
Did you guys do all the mat drills?
Yep, sure did.
Yeah, we, Don James, when I went to Cal, it was Keith Gilbertson. And,
okay.
So Gilby and that staff had come out of Washington. And
Got
so
it.
a lot of that, Steve Ettman and that whole national championship culture of, the mat drills and that whole training thing came down and was big into Cal. So,
yeah, no, we definitely did that 2 days a week for 5 weeks, I believe it was, with the time periods that were set for week 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yeah.
Yep.
All that. Yep.
So a lot of the transfer training kind of approach that we're teaching, it's coming from Franz Bosch. So just a track speed coach. But one of the things he talked about in terms of transfer was the setup. So we approach a lot of, coaches teaching a toes forward athletic position style squat, right? The knee over the arches, the instep, because that's the optimal position for force reduction. And then we want our athletes to default that onto the field, whether they're playing basketball, whether they're playing lacrosse or football. So in terms of, you began your levels with technique, what kind of approach have you taught your kind of sport athletes, or do you suggest to coaches teaching their sport athletes? Because you yourself are a power lifter,
right?
But then we're talking about kind of a means to an end training versus the end.
Yeah, what Tex is referencing is something that I always did in my training, and that I noticed that playing offensive line, if my toes were straight ahead, north and south, as I said, I was able to play off my insteps, knees over my insteps, and I was able to create, like a good, strong, pyramid. And as I said back, as long as I was able to keep that foot in that position, I was strong and stable. And then when I watched guys open their feet up, effectively, they would short step and do what's called stepping in the bucket. And I knew as a tackle and as a guard, as I set vertical, if I could keep that position. Now, I went as far as just taking it into everything. We also found that I was able to change direction much better if my foot was straight ahead opposed from open. So we went to squatting and everything, because I figured, if this is the position that I want to reinforce, I need to reinforce it in the most stressful situation. For me in the off season was lifting weights. And so when I came in and watched a lot of athletes work, and especially change direction like the RG3 or whatnot, when you watch their training and you watch the way they squat and they do things, especially with the toes open, duck footed, that was the same position when they went to go, change direction. All of a sudden he gets a wobble in the knee and he injures himself. And so we've really fought for this toes forward idea in the squatting, and people will fight us on this shit left and right. And it just merely came down. I remember when I went out to go visit Louis and train out at Westside, I watched them all squatting with their toes out. And I talked to Louis. I'm like, but aren't you, you've told me for years that guys should squat toes forward. And he's like, well, yeah, they're all too fat. They can't squat toes forward. their bellies are too big. They got to open it up to get down. But if we have athletes that can do it, we always want a more vertical toe, especially in the powerlifting. So, I mean, it's just kind of something that we've really grasped onto, and that idea of being able to activate the glute and be able to use it more so than, pushing the knees out and kind of defaulting.
Yeah, no, there's, with the squat, in my background in powerlifting, I could tell you what I thought whenever I came in, and I could tell you what I think now, and they're actually completely different. And what I thought then was, you should have your feet out wider than the shoulders, your toes as straight ahead as possible to be able to, get down to depth because of the exact thing that you're talking about. And everything had to be below parallel. And the more that I've learned, and the more that I see things, and the more that I've changed my view on things, and the more that I've talked with people like, I hit the lottery for being able to have information brought to me through the likes of Anatoly Bondarchuk, Natalia Veroshansky, Hank Kreichenhoff, all these different people, and Michael Yesus. It has really changed the way that I view things. We've got to realize and look at some things about the squat. Everybody looks at a skeleton and they think that everybody's skeleton is going to look like that. Well, we've got a lot of variants. We start out, let's just start most midline, and we'll go most lateral and distal. The acetabulum, the depth of the hip socket, and the shape of the hip socket. And how is the bottom? How wide does that little U notch come out of that thing? Okay. How shallow is the socket? How much is it anteverted or retroverted? Okay. Meaning, how much does it point forward? How much does it point back? Now let's look at the neck. Let's go down to the femoral neck. Well, we could talk about the femoral head, because this is why I've had to have a hip replacement, and I'm going to have another hip surgery in a couple of weeks. Is it nice and round, or is it more flat? That's going to affect the ability to squat. Femoral neck, what is the angle of inclination? Is it normal? Is about like this? We've got something called coxa valga that's like this, and coxa vera, so it's flat. Instead of being up and angled, you know what? I don't remember the angles of inclination. I'd have to go look it back up. Instead of being where you're supposed to be, it's flat. It's at like 90 degrees. And then we have coxa vera, which is way up high above what the normal is supposed to be. Beyond that, we've got femoral anteversion and retroversion, which is how the femoral neck angle is. Is it turned forward? Is it turned back? We'll go down the tibia, and of course we've got tibia to shin lengths and how that affects squat depth and ability to squat, plus the length of the torso. Then we go down to the tibia, and sometimes we have something called tibial torsion, right? And it is that basically the way that I look at that, and this isn't technical at all, it's look at the tibial tuberosity and look at the foot, right? If the foot and the tibial tuberosity are in the same line, you're set. If the tibial tuberosity is straight ahead and the foot is turned in or turned out, you've got some tibial torsion going on, okay? And what that would mean is that, let's say if I make everybody go with their toes straight ahead, if somebody's got tibial torsion, I'm either internally rotating everything above that, or I'm externally rotating everything above that. So, just from that carpentry standpoint, there are so many differences that change squat depth, right? As a power lifter, you look at the bottom of any of my squats, I'm actually posteriorly tilted, butt winking, essentially, even in competition, to be able to get to that depth. Why? Well, my femoral head was jacked, and I had a more shallow socket, right? I couldn't squat like that. Now, if the toe position, interesting things about the toe position. So there's things called a closed pack, which and a loose or open pack position of any of your joints, right? And that typically has to do with how much stability and tightness is there from joint surface and joint capsule. A closed pack position has got all of the tightness and stability that you could want. An open pack or loose pack is just like it sounds. It's a little bit more loose, and you get some range of motion. If you've got your toes straight ahead, you're in a closed pack position. If you turn your toes out, you are in an open pack position, more open pack up in the femoral acetabular joint. So you take that away. So if somebody's got the ability to squat, ass to grass with toes straight ahead, great. If somebody doesn't, not a big deal. because the way that I view the squat is as it is a general physical preparedness exercise. It's GPP. Its transfer is limited. What I mean by that is that as you get better in the squat, you get better at the sprints, the jumps, and the sports for a while. But after a while, as your squat improves, you no longer see a transfer. You've got to find other means. Now, you can do other things with the squat. A lot of, being in the NFL, you probably have heard Joe Ken. I'm not sure if he was in the NFL.
I heard him speak at when we were
Elite
out.
FTS.
Yeah, the Elite
Mark
FTS
Watson
deal.
event.
Yeah. So Joe was on a paper with a guy named Matt Ray, who is real tight with House. And there was about 4 or 5 other authors. And they looked at the transfer of full squats, quarter squats, and half squats on sprints and jumps. And they found that the quarter squat and half squat had a greater transfer than the full squat for highly trained athletes. I'm not saying highly talented because we're looking at Division II and down, but highly trained, meaning that they have got several years in the game.
Didn't Verkhoshansky say the same thing when he was making a differentiation between a GPP, general physical preparedness, full squat, and then a more specific specialty, when he went into like his special movements, sport specific type training movements, where they were doing half squats and quarter squats as a greater transfer to sport but he's also talking about Olympic caliber athletes.
Right. You're absolutely right. He did.
Well, I mean, but for me, and maybe this is just like personal bias, which I need to get around. I have a hard time forcing people into that position or stopping them just because I know for me to quarter squat or half squat hurts the shit out of my knees. If anything, like the stretch shortening cycle and the ability to transfer is huge. So I always thought about more like the dynamic, like the power cleans, power snatches, and more kind of those angles of the hip and the knee and whatnot. And if you think about from an open to a closed position, what you would look at, like if you could look at a quarter squat, half squat, doing those with more form of dynamic pulling was how I attacked that in a better way, just because not squatting to parallel and not being able to transition from, accentuation and, stretch shortening cycle and everything just put way too much load and actually hurt my knees. So.
Yeah, and I can definitely see that. And one of the things that I think a lot of people are misconstruing is it's not necessarily max weight on that. It's not always about the weight. It's about, popping up and down and getting that quick reversal.
Yeah.
Sure.
So the second part of Franz Bosch's transfer training is internal structure. So external structure setup, internal structure is muscle action. So kind of you want to actually look at your sport versus just looking at numbers on a spreadsheet.
Well, I mean, that was kind of how I got to, at least for me, some of the, toes forward and the things that we were doing for, squatting and pulling and whatnot was I noticed that the fastest guys that I played against, especially linebackers, were, slightly internally rotated, slightly pigeon-toed. Hips were actually, or foot position was outside the shoulders. Knees were directly over the toes. And their toes were straight ahead, if not slightly internally rotated. And I always noticed, too, that the fastest guys I played with were all slightly bow-legged, which was another interesting deal. I mean, I remember I played with a guy, John Wayne, and I cannot remember his last name. The dude looked like he literally rode a horse. They called him John Wayne because he was so pigeon-toed and so bow-legged. He was a black dude. And he was by far the fastest dude I've ever seen in my life. And I knew for defensive linemen and guys that I played against, the guys that were knock-kneed and duck-footed were not nearly as explosive as the guys that were slightly bow-legged and pigeon-toed.
Yeah.
And that was just observational, like just, when a guy walked up to the line, because you do the ocular pat down. As I'm running up to the line, I always looked at the ground and looked up, and I could, you get pretty good at assessing dudes very quickly, and, the guys that were, and then all of a sudden there would be some dude that was so far off the bell curve where I'd look at him and be like, I don't even know what the fuck this guy's going to do. So, it just became one of those things where you start noticing traits. And for me, I noticed patterns, and I just started noticing traits that the faster guys seem to be slightly pigeon-toed and bow-legged, which makes sense in terms of internal hip torque and the ability to, generate force, I would think, in just an anatomical structure.
Yeah, it puts the glutes on a pre-stretch. So then every time that they're making contact, they're hitting a little bit harder. Look at a baseball hitter. They're going to dig in and have that quad, that femur already turned in a little bit on that back leg. So whenever they load it to start the swing, it's on a pre-stretch.
Yeah.
A little bit more power.
Yeah, I had an old podiatrist. I mean, we had a Dr. Cohen who was an old podiatrist at the Eagles tell me that just observing feet, that the guys that had higher arches were always faster than the guys that had flat feet.
You know,
And
that actually comes back to the gait cycle, right? Because the pronation is the force absorption part of the gait cycle. So if somebody's stuck there, okay. So how your foot works and how it interacts with the ground, right? It starts out as, you know, your heel strikes, and then your foot comes down and it becomes a real loose, going into pronation. And doing that, it allows you to absorb force to the ground. And then your foot supinates and goes out and turns into a rigid lever. Well, the guys have got high arches, they're stuck in supination. So whenever they're hitting the ground, it's a lot more force return. Now that puts them at a greater risk for like stress fractures,
yes,
and stuff like that. Where somebody who has got the flat feet, it's more of a like a soft tissue type thing. But you know, that goes into explain. You know, everything is how the foot interacts with the ground, right? And you know, people, if anybody wants to overlook the importance of the foot and the ankle, which is one of the areas that I think that we have really overlooked, and me especially early, you know, throughout my strength and conditioning career, they're just missing the boat, man. Your knee doesn't touch the ground, your hip doesn't touch the ground. Well, if it does, that's because you're screwed. It's your foot that interacts with the ground on every repetition of every sport, but what, swimming? And so, you know, the foot function and the ankle function, we've got to understand these things.
Yeah.
And not a lot of people do. We actually include probably about 15, 20 minutes in our weekend course on the ankle.
Yeah.
One of my freshman year, I actually broke my ankle, was forced to sit out the entire season, did all the sprints, the squats necessary, but then just naturally neglected the foot. So invested a lot of personal time years after that just to make sure I never did that again. But then freaking meet Wellborn, he also invested a lot of time in it.
So Dr. Cohen, who is our podiatrist, was an old time guy, and he, you know, his father was a podiatrist before him, and so he sits down, and I have pretty high arches, and he didn't know anything about me. He's like, "Pretty fast, huh?" I was like, "Yeah, I mean, I ran one of the fast times at the combine, always been pretty fast." And he's like, "Man, we got to protect these arches." And he goes, "You have two choices." He goes, "I can make you orthotics, or I can teach you a set of exercises, and you make me a promise that the only time you'll wear shoes is when you're going to go out on the football field." He's like, "Other than that, I want you to walk around barefoot. I want you to stretch your feet, and I have a whole set of exercises I want you to work on to strengthen your feet." And he goes, "If you do that, you'll never have to wear orthotics. You'll never have any foot problems." But he goes, "If you're lazy and you want to wear shoes more, they're going to weaken your feet." But he said, "For you, especially with high arches, if you do this stuff, you'll be fine." And I was like, "I'm cool to not wear shoes. I'm from California, and I'm more than happy to do all these, you know." And so it was stretching the feet, but also doing some, you know, like basic, like, you know, splaying of the toes, trying to pick things up, you know, like making sure that, you know, as you stretch all the bones in the feet, because I mean, what are there, like 100 plus, but also, you know, just being able to constantly stretch and be able to, you know, work on, you know, flexibility and just different factors. And, you know, because of it, I had no foot problems in the NFL, and I never had to wear orthotics, and still don't. And I think even though I had knee issues, people would always ask me, "Oh, you have knee issues?" And I'm like, "Yeah, because a dude literally ran his helmet into my knee." And, you know, they'd always ask me about the feet. And I'm like, surprisingly, I don't have any foot problems, which is kind of interesting, because if you look at kind of different athletes, sometimes people have lower legs, sometimes they have knees, and they have hips. And, you know, it's pretty interesting to see where things default on guys.
Absolutely.
I wanted to transition into the research side of things. So you moved your career from coaching into, I guess, the laboratory for lack of a better term.
Aren't you jealous?
I kind of am.
I can hear you over here. You're like, "Oh God,
I got a little pep in my voice." But and hearing you speaking at the NSCA, you explained your mission, kind of bringing coaching back into research. So I'd love to have you share your mission with what you're trying to accomplish at the University of Missouri, and going into presenting at all these conferences and seminars.
Yeah, you know, one of the things is that, I mean, it's a couple fold. And I'll start with this one, that a lot of people think that there's no research that's out there and that everybody's had the research. Usually they're not. They just don't have the right search terms. And they don't know about these things called, like, you know, PubMed and Google Scholar. And I'll tell you that anytime that I thought that I was ahead of the game, if I changed my search term by one word, all of a sudden then I get like 40 things that were what I thought was brand new had actually been done for 80 years. And the other side of things is that people complain about no research being done on elite level athletes. And this is strength and conditioning coaches are doing it. It's like, well, why would I do this? A 12-year-old does it. Or they were doing that on 12-year-olds. Like, yeah, you know what, dude? You've got the population. They don't. The researchers don't. So if you're doing something that's interesting, you're doing something that you think is advanced and that works fantastically, you need to hook up with somebody and put that out there. This is the way that we can get buy-in from the coaches, is that we need to be out there doing research. We need to gain legitimacy as a profession. Right now, to be a college strength and conditioning coach, you don't have to have anything, right? You have to have a college degree is required by most universities. I do not believe that's an NCAA requirement. That is just a university requirement to work, in higher education. And then
you have to have a master's.
Huh?
No,
you don't have to have a master's. There's plenty of people on staff that
I like this side of this.
Oh, I thought you had to have a master's to be a
it's
college.
recommended to apply, or actually, you got to have a master's to get an internship. It's a bad joke. Sorry.
Yeah. Now you don't have to have a master's, but that's the way that typically people get into it because they started out as a graduate assistant, worked up the chain.
Sure.
So they got a master's as a function of being in it. And then the certification. We saw that whole thing out at Oregon, and that the individual had a cross country, track and cross country, like a high school track and cross country certification. So there isn't anything any mandated guidelines from the NCAA on what they have to have. Well, we need to do things to prove that we are professionals. So, and what do professionals do? Well, you look at physical therapy, you look at athletic training. They try different interventions, and then they publish. Did it work? Did it not? So I think that's one of the steps into it. And then eventually, if we want to actually truly have legitimacy, there's going to have to be licensure. Because until there's licensure, the head coach can just go hire his buddy that he went to high school with that liked to lift weights back then, and doesn't know anything about sickle cell anemia, cerebral meningitis, any of the orthopedic or medical issues that could go into causing serious problems for the athletes. But coaches, then they typically think, well, I don't have anybody who can help me. Well, most college coaches are at a college, and there's these people called professors that work there, and they've got to do this thing called research to be able to keep their jobs, or because they enjoy it. And if you find anybody that if there is statistics, in engineering or whatever, professor that has an interest in sport, dude, you're set, man. You're set. And if they don't know somebody, have them contact somebody like me or Andy Fry or Jerry Mayhew or somebody that if we don't have time to do it, we probably know somebody. If they're not at their university, they're at the next university over. For instance, a guy that's on my special interest group on my executive committee is at Transylvania University. Well, they don't have any physical education, kinesiology, anything like that. But 7 miles away at Eastern Kentucky, a good friend of mine is there, and I've got those two hooked up, and they're working on some projects together and exploring the different interventions that they've done. So, there's people that are out there and that are willing. We just got to have the coach. We got to get both people at the table. That's it. We got to get both sides of the same table. Some coaches don't give a shit about research, and that's fine. Okay, this is the way that I've always done it. This is the way that I'm always going to do it. Great. You know what? You don't need to be at the table. But the people that want to make a difference, let's get them at the table. Let's get the researchers at the table, and let's go. As a result of this, with you were at the first derivation of this, where we showed the latest applicable research that somebody could go and implement in their weight room the next day. And we'll be doing that. Knock on wood. We'll be doing that every coaches conference. We're also, as a function of the special interest group, we're going out and getting the researchers that have published research on athletes and giving them giving the practitioners an opportunity to ask them questions through a Facebook Live thing on the Special Interest Groups page. We had Andy Galpin, and I can't remember who's next. I want to say we're looking at trying to get Mike Zordos at Florida Atlantic, who's done a lot of stuff on undulating periodization and RPE and velocity with power lifters and some athletes as well. So, we're trying to get everybody, the right people on the bus and get it going, because this divide that exists, this chasm that exists between the two professions within the field it's ludicrous. We need to, let's bridge the gap, as the recent motto of the NSCA has become, and let's get this done. Let's get it done right. Let's find out what works.
Yeah, it was great in your introduction to just drop 1, 2, 3, 4 immediate takeaways that are science-based that coaches could apply on Monday after the conference. In order to help with that, how can coaches read research papers or studies and really kind of find takeaways? Do you have any suggestions to kind of help their lens that they're looking through?
Yeah, there's a few things. First is, of course, read the abstract, and then don't stop there. Go to the methods, right? See who was the subject population that was done. Look at the pictures. If it's a book, I'm going to be reading pictures. Shows my Oklahoma education there, right there, huh? I'll be looking at the pictures. Yeah. If the book doesn't have pictures, I'm probably not going to be reading it. But you'll look and you'll get a lot of information out of just simply the pictures. Like I've looked at some papers that were looking at prediction of 1RM on a bench press, right? And how do they do it? On a Smith machine with the feet in the air. But it didn't say that anywhere in the paper. But it showed it in the picture. So you want to look at the methods, what was done, how was the protocol done, what was the population that was used, and that'll give you a lot more information. Then if you'll go back, you'll see you look at the conclusions. They kind of relate what they found as to what everybody else has found. And then, and that's within the conclusions and discussion. And that's how I'd recommend for people to look at it, because you've got to know who was it actually done on, and what did they actually do, and what did they actually find. So interesting take off of that. We were talking about you're talking about increasing the type 2 fibers earlier, way earlier in the discussion. There was a paper on velocity loss, 20 versus 40% velocity loss that was out, and they were just looking at strength gains and changes in vertical jump in 10 meter sprint time. And whenever I was looking at it, I looked at they happened to post something about the fiber type and how that changed over the course of the training block. And the lower velocity loss actually had a decrease in type 1 cross-sectional area and an increase in type 2 cross-sectional area. What is this? This is selective hypertrophy. You could use training with lower velocity losses, so like at 90% or 80% instead of going all the way out to fatigue, to cause your type 2 fibers to hypertrophy and your type 1 to not, or to not to the same extent. And whenever we think about this, I'm old enough to know who Werner Gunther was, and I've watched a lot of the videos online. What did his training look like? Everything was explosive. Everything was explosive.
Including his hair.
Yeah, including his hair. Yeah, he had a great mullet and a great mustache.
Mullet in the game.
Yeah. But, something that a lot of people don't realize is that there was a 2003 paper that Werner Gunther was on, and it looked at the morphological profile, the muscle fiber typing of two different world champions shot putters, him and somebody else. He had less than 40% of type 2 fibers. Less than 40%. You know who normally has over 60% type 1 fibers? Cross-country runners. This person who had the fiber type makeup of a cross-country runner had selective hypertrophy enough to where his type 2 fibers that were only less than 40% number, the cross-sectional area was close to 70%.
Wow.
So through his training, he was able to blow those type 2 fibers up and utilize them. Now, 3 to 5 years after he was done competing, he went back down to, I think it was 37%, which was the original number, and 37% cross-sectional area as well of the type 2 fiber whenever he wasn't training.
Maybe had a change in supplementation.
Well,
You know,
I mean,
yeah, we can't. I don't think that was disclosed because I think some records might have, or championship.
I
right
mean,
A lot of guys go train in the Cayman Islands.
Well,
Well,
I mean,
off season. It's a good place.
I think I remember reading something a long time ago that was talking about like clenbuterol, for example, was in some like rat study or something, they were using clenbuterol to convert fiber types, and so I'm sure there is a pharmaceutical approach to probably enhancing fiber type. So unfortunately, you probably can't test that.
I'm sure it is. Yeah, the IRB, I guarantee you will not approve that. If it does, I'm going to sign up for that study of my own.
You're like, give me everything you got.
Need
Gamma
some more
radiation.
Underground testing is what we need.
Well, I mean, what was pretty fascinating, and you know this from dealing with the West Side guys, Louis' street knowledge in terms of that stuff is like,
yeah.
And I'm sure at some point somebody's like, man, we need to go download all this stuff out of his brain because he's going to pass away and take like a wealth of knowledge of pushing the bounds of what is humanly possible.
Right.
Yeah.
He's also been testing on apes for the last 2 decades.
You have to remember we're risen apes, not fallen angels.
Gotcha, that's right.
As we were on the podcast yesterday or the day before, but no, it's. So, I mean, you think about it. I mean, form follows function. If you design the training model correctly, you can use the said principle to drive what we're looking for.
I want more than if. I want people to understand how to design the model to drive the adaptation.
Well, yes, but you have to remember if we could sum up this entire talk into one statement, is that you as the individual have to figure out how to pull that from each individual athlete because everybody's different. We can go test, velocity-based training, and I'd be interested to see if you were to take, let's say, 100 people and get them to train within the same velocity, if that they would drive the same adaptation.
There's going to be some carryover that works for everyone, right? And
Sure.
then there's that percentage of
Well, I mean,
individuality.
that's the bell curve.
Individuality.
I mean,
So principle right there.
yeah, there's going to be a bell curve. I mean, just like the Gunther guy, with a massive amount of slow twitch muscle fiber, but the guy found a training method that allowed him to compete at a high level.
Right.
Now, if
tons of bounding, tons of sub-maximal throwing things as fast as he can.
But think about this: probably because he had a lot of type 1 fibers, he was able to handle a shit ton of volume and load.
True, right?
Which is what we found is that, I mean, guys who are extremely fast twitch, like, and I made this observation watching quarterbacks that we played with. Some guys, like a Tom Brady, there's a little dude whose entire job, he has a clicker and he counts every throw that Tom Brady makes. And when Tom Brady gets done with his volume, he's done for the day. I played with other guys that was like half that volume, and I played with other dudes that they just let him throw as much as he wanted, and the more he threw, the better he got. And we talk about this thing called big monkey versus small monkey, that there's people that can handle a shit ton of volume and they get better, and then there's people that can not handle the volume that have to work within a more intensity based deal. And the interesting part is football, for example, naturally selects for the big monkey, because just to get to the point of the NFL, the amount of fucking work that you have to do. And I remember in college, I played with a dude who was a really good offensive lineman, came in as an 18-year-old kid and had benched 400 pounds, which was fucking unheard of. And every day he was at college, he got weaker. And I remember he barely benched 300 by a senior, and my strength coach like belittled him like a motherfucker. And I remember like he was my roommate, and I was like, "Doe, what happened?" He's like, "Dude, it's too much fucking work." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "I lifted weights 2 days a week and I benched 400 pounds. Now we got to train 6 days a week and I'm getting fucking weaker." He's like, "It's too much." And I remember being like, "Shut the fuck up, you pussy. You just don't want it enough, And now after all this deal, I look back and think, what's the effective dose to result in the maximal performance? For him, it was 2 days a week. Other people, can train, 27 times in a week, which is kind of what we see the CrossFit where, hey, Rich Froning trains, 14 times a day and he's in phenomenal shape. And then other people are like, "What's Rich doing?" And they do it and they end up with adrenal fatigue in the fucking hospital.
He's outside of the bell curve.
Well, he is. But you have to think that certain sports will naturally select for that type of person. But the problem becomes you have to know as an athlete what your wheelhouse is. Right. I mean, I knew playing football, I knew exactly what my wheelhouse was. We were talking about on the podcast yesterday. I remember going and watching film with my coach. And I remember after about an hour, I finally was like, "Do you have any dudes that are like 6'5" white guys that I can watch?" He's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "You're showing me 6'8" Trey Thomas, who's 365 pounds. I'm like, "I'm a 6'5" white dude. Find me 6'5" white guys. So he showed me like Jim Lachey and Gary Zimmerman and all these guys that were more similar to me. And I was watching and I was like, I can do that. I will do that. And I did it and I was fine. But like that part of like knowing who you are. And I think the big part of the training experience is learning who you are and what you can and can't do and what works for you and what doesn't. And then having somebody like a Bryan Mann or, Tex McQuilkin, and probably not you, guide you on the path where like, here's a dose of reality and this is what you need to do. And the thing that I really I'm going to go back on a page that Bryan laid out where he talked about, technique, base level, absolute, and then specific with velocity. I think where people fuck up is they really get out of the groove in these things and they're not having somebody point it in their face and being like, all right, are you ready to advance to the next point? And, that's something that I've been beating on for almost the last decade is like, know yourself as a training. And if you've trained enough, like T Nation asked me to write an article for him and I pretty much like couldn't do it. I just couldn't fucking whore myself to it, which was, how do you know you're a beginner? And it was one sentence. If you're reading this, you're a beginner.
Yeah. Are you looking for information?
Yeah. If you're waiting for me to tell me you're a beginner because, and there's a weird thing, and this with lifters, right? When you're a beginner, you don't know anything. So then you listen to somebody and then you get to the point where you think you know everything. And then finally you get to the point where you realize that you really don't know anything and that you have to reach out to really intelligent people to hopefully mentor and guide you through this. So I remember I got to this point where I didn't know anything. I fucking thought I knew everything. And then I realized I didn't know anything and I needed to reach out and like find people that weren't, that were smarter than me that could help me design this shit.
The scary are the people who never leave the second stage.
Well, it's because, they're on the internet and, they're the guys with, 10,000 posts on some obscure forum, big, bulky and tan. And, hey, bro, you just need to do this. And, and that effectively, but what's killer too, especially, where we're living is this idea of performance-based training. And unfortunately, 90% of the world isn't focused on performance-based training. What are they focused on? Aesthetics.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't give a shit about being strong and explosive or being athletic. I just want to look strong, explosive, and athletic.
I'm trying to look good naked.
Yeah. And like, to me, like, that's a function of like caloric deficit, aerobic work, and doing, sets of 5 to 12 reps with 60 to 90 seconds rest, like 4 to 6 days a week. Yeah. And I'm sure if we asked Bryan, he could fucking send us that program and he would probably like fucking throw up as he sent it because that's not what you geek on. You're not trying to get people ready for figure shows, and, you're trying to look and say, hey, dude, here's elite human performance. I want to work with the world's best athletes and try to make them just 1 or 2 or 3% better. And how do I work with that? And, that's where we all want to live. And unfortunately, that is such a small section that you looked at and said, shit, man, I want to do research and I want to get there. And it's fucking awesome. So
Bryan, did you have an approach when you were coaching athletes to identify a big versus a little monkey, or if somebody's having an off day? Did you use the vertical jump in training? I know John.
No, I didn't. What I had found was that if I tried to do the same thing every week or every day, they just got bored and they wouldn't do it. But, if you want to talk about big monkey, small monkey, like a one-time thing, yeah, I did. I took their power off of the vertical jump, and I did basically I allometrically scaled it so that we would have everybody on the same thing. And allometrically scaling is body weight to the 0.67 power. And that essentially, John's skeleton is going to take up more of his mass than yours because he's bigger. Taller, and he's, the skeletal mass is not.
And I'm not a hobbit.
Well, I am in the 96th percentile for bone density.
But you're a hobbit.
What does that mean?
I got big bones.
Yeah, right.
See, well, what's interesting is everybody like I realized the other day that all you guys are under 6 feet tall, which is hilarious.
Dr. Mann was talking.
I didn't even date girls that were under 6 feet tall for a couple of years, let alone have people work for me under 6 feet tall.
So then I allometrically scaled it, and then I did Z-scores from there. And then that's how basically we could tell that, I wouldn't say big monkey, small monkey, but what it really did was, interesting retroactively looking at this with our data, all the guys that were over 3 standard deviations above on their power, right? Whenever they came in as a freshman, if they were 3 standard deviations over their allometrically scaled power, those guys typically, whenever we push the strength hard in that, in those earlier levels, they actually got slower and their jumps went down. It was just that they were a different animal, a different breed. So looking at stuff like that on the initial evaluations, I think I would probably change the way that I approach the training of those athletes and have a lot more power-based stuff right off the bat. But I just got a text that my daughter is very, very sick, so I'm going to
go, please.
Yeah, we can.
No, that's a great place to end. Doc, thank you so much for taking the time to not only educate us and, selfishly, I'd like to try to book another one of these and a little farther down. And, it was awesome to connect. And I really just appreciate you taking the time. And, dude, stoked to meet you and, follow your work. So,
and quickly, I know you've got a massive speaking schedule. How can people, where do they go to find out your schedule? How can they get in touch with you or follow you?
Well, that's a damn good question. Everybody is on me about getting a website up, but I just don't know how to do it. You want to know how to get a bigger bench? I know how to do that, but website, I've got no idea. So
I'm pretty sure there's somebody listening to this right now that could probably help Dr. Bryan Mann build a website.
I could put him in contact with people.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, but they're usually strippers in New Orleans, and
they work with the web too. They know coding. They got to earn a living, John. They're artists.
I can't have my name on Pornhub. I'm just saying.
Well,
do you want the hits or not?
How much traffic do you want?
I've got in July I'm going to be at the Okanagan, and then the following week I'm at the national conference. The following week at CVASPS. August nothing. September maybe something. October the leaders course for the NSCA. November I'm down in Australia at their national conference, and then 2 velocity workshops. December in Pittsburgh at Todd Hammer's thing. Then January it all starts all over again with coaches conference.
You gonna make it down to Texas anytime soon?
Hey, you host a conference down there, and I'll go see my sister. So
okay.
We'll get her done.
We have a conference in December that I would like to invite you to, and I'll send you an invite if you can make it. Would love for you to attend or present. I mean, whenever you want. Just to be able to hang out and get some FaceTime, but also, if we could get you on there, I'd love to hear you speak.
As long as it's not the same weekend as Todd Hammer's, we can probably pull it off.
Okay. I think it's the second weekend in December.
That's when his is.
Of course. Damn it.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, we'll have to go kill him, so don't worry about that. Well, cool. Right. Well, thank you.
We'll work around. So, yes, sir. We appreciate your time, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Now it's time for you to empower your performance. Dr. Bryan Mann is obviously a busy man. Even without a website, you can creep on him on Instagram or Twitter under the same handle @JBryanMann. Bryan writes regularly for Elite FTS and is author of several books, including The Complete Guide to Powerlifting for Human Kinetics, which, if I had kids, sounds like a great bedtime story. And ahoy hoy, do not forget the Power Athlete Symposium is popping off December 8th through the 10th. If you'd like to get tickets to attend the event, be sure to check out powerathletehq.com and go to the events tab. Until next time, bye!